I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me, there was no breeze of motion, there was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I'd been injured somehow. I fearfully ran back home. I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week. Actually, because that was when I met Mar. She and I got along great, though to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched onto some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor. I hardly worried about them. The color of the neighbor's car changed from a dark blue to a black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging it off the difference. 2 days later at work, the co-worker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said that his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as it sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience found me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I don't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion, "how'd you get a key?" She laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened the door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Living together. I literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap instead of causing a scene. I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation. But I did find something out of the ordinary, a date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What was I facing? What kind of creature would consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or joke from that time period. Something absurdly precious and had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never embedded alcohol, but I drank coffee religiously and checked the date every time I woke up for 3 years. I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, and that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets and the time of my favorite television show aired. That kind of thing. Always those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day I grew careless. I let myself get really into a season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of action, a young boy came into my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see him or know the first years of his life. Mar and I obviously got married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains they've contained. It was snowing outside, holding my son in my lap. I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life is this going to be if slips in concentration would cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. Priests didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on their scans and tests, but they'd happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what all this looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser, but I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation. She arrived by not unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the setting on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat her down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really wasn't our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as the dating jitters. I was excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live them. And so it went on for a few years, from my perspective, while minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily. Major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I shut up and listened, making sure to get a lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the furthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson and asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then I was back in a 2-month relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd miss the first go around, and I come to understand what I never meant, that I was never mentally absent. I will always be there eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at the best parts ahead, but of course I wouldn't be writing this if I hadn't gotten to the worst. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, it began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be the jump between times in my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time I meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the truth depth of fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was one of the constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pain I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I never yet shifted while watching the patterns of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" "Eh?" He startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned and, as not sure whether I was joking, handed me a stack of papers. He said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you like to read it and tell me what you think?" Of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see." He burned bright red. "Trying to, anyway. All right. Run off. I'll read this right now." The words were blurry and annoyed. I looked for glasses and I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible. I wanted to leap back into to a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I'd have left there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now an adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door as a group of extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs into the room. How was it? Well, it's terrible, I told him truthfully, but it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people. But the structure of the story itself is very solid. I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story. He nodded. It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal and not hopeful like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that, I told him. An idea occurred to me. If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures? Sure, I've read everything I can. I love it. Wearily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone about my life, about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. The teenager looked at me. He took it well. Are you serious? Yes. He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. I'll look into it, see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound. Wow, sounds like a plan. I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have such a serious response. But how will I get those notes in one place? Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them, he said, frowning with a thought. Then I'll get them and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life, see if there's a pattern. For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there. Sure. He turned and left the living room. I peered after him, and I heard banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal bursting stacks of paper. He explained, Holy crap! But of course, being a teenager, he can't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. Did I write those? He looked up at me and wondered, Yeah, or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers and then covered the box. So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird. I understood that much. Right. He gulped. There are 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time. His tone dropped to a deadly seriousness. But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can. Tears flowed down my cheeks, and then I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs, out of order. From the first box was actually the 13th, and my last box was the first. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names, places, and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man from at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. "Come on, I think I finally figured it out." I was frail, so moving was painful. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" "Yes." He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of the man. The pattern finally revealed itself. "How long have you worked on this?" I asked him, aghast. "Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine." His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. "It'll be worth it." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look, this shot is carefully calibrated." The electric zap from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. The bulgy, leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my elbows and touching each ear like it's a slug-like body. Its slug-like body ran over my shoulders and into my very soul. It was a parasite. It was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it's going to hurt really badly. Are you up for this?" Fearful, I asked, "Is Mar here?" He softened his face. "No, not for a few years now." I can tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. "How?" "We had this conversation a lot," he responded. "Are you sure you want to know?" It never makes you feel better." Tears brimmed my eyes. "Then I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive." He makes a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines and hooked several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked, "I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of a lesser spawns of, and it feeds off of the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness reality. When details like names and color and objects change, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands of the creature as the creature ate its way through you." I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head in an exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. "What's that thing?" He paused his work and grew pale. "I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me." After a deep breath, he began moving again. He placed his fingers near a few switches. "Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite. It's basically an electroshock therapy." I could still see Mar smile, even though she was dead. I had just been with her a few moments ago. "Do it." The click of a switch echoed in my ears. I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within the image was convulsing. Oh no, it did hurt. Nothing I had ever been. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. My vision shook and the fire burned everywhere in every nerve in my body. I could see the reflected trembling white silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, six clawed lizard like limbs under its leech like body, and it cut into me in every attempt to stay latched on. Electricity made my memories flare. Mar's smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire that was as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by the feasting evil on my back. I never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I'd jump around a dozen times but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mar's hand and be with her. No. No! That moment shifted seamlessly to holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down into tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd never seen the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the bad parts. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst parts, the inevitable end that would all one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machine's electricity chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. Crept forward just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze, and while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, my phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason. She'd admit 30 years later that years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in the hospital bed dying. It was going to end in an unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone and long before him, and the end of it all, the only thing I would have left is sitting and watching the snow fall. By now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone with a smile and said, "Who is this?" Even though I already knew. Author's note. Together, my grandson and I did set out to write a tale of his life. Unfortunately, his amnesia disease progressed rapidly, and we were never able to finish it. He's still alive, but I imagine that mentally he is in a better place than the nursing home. I'd like to think he's back in his younger days, living a life and being happy, because the reality is much colder It's snowing today. He loves the snow. When I visited him, he didn't recognize me, but he did smile as he sat looking at the window.